It's great to be back at family camp. Scotty and I were discussing last night, when did we first come? I don't remember. Whether it was 70, 71, or 72. We said 72. I don't, was it 71? Okay. We came on staff in 70. I was up in North Alabama in Decatur, and Joel McDavid was then the senior pastor, and Dolphin Wave was looking at some of the other churches in town that were becoming rather gray and decided they needed a younger staff. And so he invited me to come join the staff, along with Henry Roberts and himself and Jim Mason, who most of you probably only know by name at the Jim Mason School. But it was my great fortune to work with him and Julia Hoagland. And I came to be the Director of Christian Education and Youth Ministry. And Jim was adult, and Julia was children. Julia had already retired, I think, 3 times, and they had talked her into coming back. And after 2 or 3 years, she retired again. And being youth ministry and having children is not the easiest of tasks, because to be available, you have to be available for youth when youth are available, which is afternoons and weekends when family is also available. So Scotty and Skipper made a lot of trips and tubed down the Escatawba River, and we had a great time. But Joel and I talked and decided that Kathy ought to come be the youth director. And I moved over and took children's ministries as Julia retired. And we had a wonderful 7 years in Mobile. And I remember the Dennises going with me to Sumatonga. That Sumatonga was my camp because I grew up in North Alabama. I wasn't that familiar with Blue Lake at that time. And when you have children's camps, there's a rest period after lunch.
Sounds good.
Well, you know, it works if you know how to work it. And we were fortunate at Sumatonga. We were in the lodge. They had speakers in every room. And I would go to the sound room, and I would pick up a book such as Jack Tales or Grandfather Tales, which were collected in the 1940s, 30s, and 40s by Richard Chase up in the mountains of Appalachia. And they're written down, they're transcribed just as he recorded them. And I would read stories, and I would spin records. Scotty was the guy that did all the Parabies? Alan Sherman records. Stewart Dill and Doug Hall and those 2 boys learned them and would do songs at family camp like Skin, You Gotta Have Skin. Yeah, that's right. They can still do it. Well, maybe we need to have a little show. But I'd get into the store. Oh, we had letters from Mama, too. It started with Charlie Weaver, who was on Jack Parr's Tonight Show. This is ancient history for most of you, but it's current events for some of us. But I had one of his books, and I'd read some of those letters. And some of these ingenious campers started writing letters to Mama and would appear in the mail. So I started to read the letters that they wrote, and I still have some of them along the way. But when I'd get into the stories, I knew they were resting, because when I'd wake them up and say it's horizontal showtime's over, for the next hour they'd see me, they'd stop and want to know how the story ended, because they'd gone to sleep and missed it. So when they talked me into coming to conference staff in Andalusia, and I left Dolphin Way, I was responsible for 11 summers of camping here at Blue Lake, which is probably one of the major reasons I finally moved on. I really loved it, but boy, the pressure gets to you after a while. So building on that horizontal showtime, since I wasn't out here, I would come out, but I didn't have to stay out here. I recruited the volunteer director who came all week and stayed, and I tried to make them happy. And one of the things I did was to record a horizontal showtime that put it on tape, mixed it the same way just like I'd done live with these Dolphin Way campers at Sumatonga. And they would come in the air conditioning of the gym there and lay on the floor and listen to the tapes. And it worked real well. Somewhere amongst all my stuff, those tapes are. One of these days, I hope I come across them again. So I retired in conference of '99 and was going to Tennessee. My mother had moved into independent living outside of Nashville there, and we had taken her old family home place, 60 acres and a farmhouse. That's part of it's pre-Civil War. It started as a one-room cabin with a sleeping loft and a dirt floor, and just under 100 years ago they added a two-story to the front. In the early 30s they wallpapered it because Mother said they got tired of the brown walls. And when we took the wallpaper off, we realized that was the insulation. So we put in insulation. We took the interior walls down and put insulation in, rewired, and put in central heat and air. And it's a very comfortable house, but it's a very old house. It looks like it's a very old house. It never lived there until I moved there in February of 2000. My mother died on May the 19th, and I was retiring on the 31st and moving that summer. But since Mother wasn't there, I didn't get in a hurry to move until the Lord sent a couple to see me in Dothan who were moving from Birmingham, and they wanted our house. And I hadn't put it on the market, and I hadn't done anything to it. And they wanted it as is because they were going to do some changes to it. And for the first time in all my moving and buying, selling houses, I did finally have some capital gains. So we sold it and moved. Well, we got up there, and I visited there a lot as a boy. And yesterday, I was thinking about one of those happenings of when I was a boy up there. Now, Mother and her two sisters got the house, the barns, and 60 acres. One of the brothers got acres adjoining, and he built a house across the creek over there. And he had two sons, both older than I was. So when I would go, I'd love to go over and follow Billy and Joe around and play with them. And I probably got in the way for a while anyway, more than I helped, but I tended to go over there at least during the day. I very seldom slept over there, but sometimes I did. And he had mules. He had a tractor, but he had mules. And I got to where I sort of liked mules. You could use them to pull the wagon, and you could get on them and ride them. The only problem with riding a mule is when it decides it wants to go to the barn, you better just duck your head because you're probably not going to change its mind. I decided I wanted a mule. Now, we lived in Fort Payne, Alabama. We lived there, actually, I sold the house after Mother's death, so they were well over 50 years they lived there. That's where I went through 12 years of school. And we lived on town there, and my dad was the manager of the Rural Electric Cooperative up there. So one day I was over there at Uncle Will's house, and I said, Uncle Will, you know, I sure would like a mule. I'd like to have one I could ride anytime I wanted to. And he said, Mark, you know you can't have a mule. You live in town. And I said, but Uncle Will, we got a big yard, and there's a 2-car unattached garage. I could probably keep him over there on one side of it. He said, Mark, you know you can't have a mule. Besides, mules are expensive. A good mule run you $500 or more. You don't have that kind of money. I said, no, sir, I don't. He said, well, you just forget about having a mule. But I didn't forget about it. I wanted a mule. And I thought about on down Patton Road and on around the curve on what is now Cox Road, but those days it was still Patton Road. There was another farmer down there beyond Uncle Carl, and he had some mules, and I got to thinking one day, maybe he had one. Maybe I could get one down there. So the road was crushed limestone. And I went walking down that road one day when I was up there in the summertime, and on around there was a curve. And probably some of you aren't familiar with rock roads. But traffic on rock roads tends to make the rock move so that there's a couple of tire track areas. Well, on the curve, the rocks move to the outside edge and sort of pile up. Well, I got to that curve, and I got over there, and I think I was pretending that I was at the circus, and I was walking the wire, balancing myself on those rocks. Now, the road was over here, but down this side, it was a pretty deep ditch. And it was fairly steep, and there were a bunch of rocks down there and a bunch of briar bushes. And I'm walking around there, balancing, and I got on around. And as I got around the curve, I got to looking at that field over there. It was the prettiest green field that I'd ever seen. And in that green field were these orange balls. And I thought, oh, those are pretty orange balls. I wonder what they are. Well, I got on down to the farmer's house and walked up on his porch and reached over on the screen door. And he came to the door and said, howdy, son. I said, howdy. He said, what can I do for you? I said, well, I was wondering if you might have a mule that you'd be interested in selling. He said, son, you know a good mule's going to run you $500. You got that kind of money? I said, well, no, sir, but I thought maybe you had a real old one or a real young one that you might sell cheap. He said, no, son, I just don't think I can help you out. And I turned and disappointed and started to step off the porch, and I remembered the field. And I stopped and I said, hey, mister. He said, yeah. I said, that field down there near the curb. Yeah. That big green field with those orange balls in it. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I said, what are those orange balls? He said, why, son, those things are... You don't know what those things are? I said, no, sir. He said, son, where do you live? I said, oh, well, I live in Fort Payne, Alabama. Fort Payne, Alabama. Well, no wonder you don't know what those are. Son, those things are mule eggs. Now, you might not be able to afford a mule, but maybe you could afford a mule egg. And he said, I said, well, how much are mule eggs? And he said, well, how much have you got? Well, I reached in my pocket and pulled out all my coins and counted them out, and $1.79 is what I had. He said, son, you are in luck today. The price of mule eggs, including tax, is $1.79. I said, well, I want one. Well, he went down to the field and he got a nice big round one, and he brought it back up there and gave it to me on the porch. It had about 2 inches of green stem attached to it. Oh, it was a beautiful mule egg. And I started to go with it, and he said, hold on, son, now, you know what to do with that? I said, well, no, sir. And he said, son, is your Uncle Will got any chickens? And I said, yes, sir. He said, you ever seen those hens sitting on those nests hatching those eggs? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, what you need to do is sit on this egg real regular so that mule will hatch out. Well, I took it down there and I went to Uncle Will's barn. Barn standing there today. Uncle Will used to tease me about it was built the same year I was born and how much bigger it was than I was. It's got those nice wide boards, something like that, with a crack between each board, about like that. And I went over there and got some hay, and I put my mule egg down in that hay, and I got a gunny sack and laid on top of it. And every day I'd go find a Sears and Roebuck catalog or something and go sit out there on that mule egg, and there was enough light that came through the crack so I could read. And I'd sit out there. Nobody knew what I was doing. I was just sitting out there on my mule egg. I'd been out there about a week. And I got to thinking, I wonder how long it takes this mule egg to hatch. I think I'll see if it's starting to crack anywhere. So I took the sack off and I got the hay and I pushed it away and I got to looking and I sort of rolled it over. And on the bottom, there was a soft brown spot. I thought, law me, that man sold me a rotten mule egg. Well, I figured he didn't mean to. I didn't think he would cheat me. So I'd just take it back up there and get me another one or get my $1.79 back. So I got that mule egg up in my arms and I was walking down Patton Road and I got to that curve and I was walking over on the edge and I wasn't trying to show out. I was just walking over there and all of a sudden on that pile of crushed limestone my foot slipped. And I fell down on my knee. Hurt. And I dropped my mule egg. And it started rolling down the embankment of the ditch down there. And it hit the bottom. It hit those rocks. And it busted open. And you know what happened? A little mule jumped out. He was about that long. Had long mule ears. Had a little short white mule tail. I figure a mule's got to grow and get older before it gets that long flowing tail. But there was my mule. And I started down the bank to get my mule. And he started to run. And I said, hold on, come back, I'm your pappy, I'm your pappy. And he just kept running. And I'm running through these briar bushes, getting scratched, and my shirt torn, and I lost sight of him. I thought, I don't think I'll get him. And I went back up to the road, and I sat down on the edge of the road there, and I shed some tears. I was so sad because my mule had run away. And then I got to thinking about it. That mule was so little, it would probably take years and years for him to get big enough for me to ride. And besides that, he was so fast, I'd probably never be able to catch him to ride. So, you know, I still have never owned a mule. But that's my experience with mule eggs. Fort Payne is actually in the valley between two mountains, although today the city limits are so expanded, they've run on out in the mountain and so forth. It's a lot different when I was a boy. As I said, Dad was a manager of electric cooperative, and I didn't see a lot of him. He worked real hard trying to bring electricity up there at the end of the war. And one day he said to me, it was summer, I think I'd finished the 3rd grade. He said, Mark, you want to go fishing in the morning? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, we'll get up and we'll go. Now, truth be known, I really don't care that much for fishing. I mean, it's not very action-oriented, at least for me. You just sitting there. But Dad invited me to go, and I always liked to go when I could go with Dad, so I was quite willing to go. And the next morning we got up, and we went out and got in that old 1940 Chevrolet. It wasn't that old then, but it was a 1940 Chevrolet. We got in it, and Daddy started driving across Sand Mountain. The road was paved all the way. We went off the other side of Sand Mountain towards Scottsboro at the Tennessee River. And where you would go across the river on the B.B. Comer Bridge, he stopped and turned left and went down a dirt road running beside the river. Now today the road is well paved and there are lots of houses down through there. But then there were houses were scattered and the road was dirt. We drove a spell and he pulled over to the side of the road and he said, well, this looks like a good place to fish. And we got the fishing poles and we got everything out and started baiting the hooks, and I got my line in the water while he was finishing up, and yep, I caught the first fish. It was a fish about that long. And Daddy said we should throw it back. And we did. And fished all morning long, and I caught several fish, all big enough to throw back. Now, Daddy had got him a string of fish going there, and it got on to be up to sun up in the high part of the heavens, and he said, are you hungry? Are you about ready for lunch? And I said, well, yes, sir, I believe I could eat. And he said, well, let's go get us some lunch. Now, sometimes Mother would fix us a picnic, but she hadn't this morning, so we got back in that Chevrolet and went on down that dirt road. There were no golden arches when I was a little boy. They hadn't been invented yet. I'm that old. Yeah. But we got to a place where there was a store. It had a big blue and white pure oil sign out front and 2 gas pumps. One was premium and one was regular, and the gas was leaded. And a building that could have used some paint, except you didn't really notice it. It was a wood building, storefront, because it had signs all over it. Quaker Oil, Garrett Dental Sweet Snuff, Coca-Cola, drink Coca-Cola. We got out of the car, and there wasn't any air conditioning either. But the store had a screen door on it. The windows were open with screens on there. So if there was a breeze blowing, it would get in there. Got to the screen door, and painted on the screen itself, it said, Colonial is good bread. Scotty and I stopped at Country's Barbecue in Troy Friday night and ate supper, and I looked up. And it wasn't a screen door, it was glass, or probably wasn't even glass, it was acrylic, I guess. And there it said, Colonial is good bread. They'd painted it right there on that door. That was advertising. But the interesting part to me, I remember reaching for the door handle. And the door handle was about that long with a bar that went out to the side that said Marita bread. And I thought that's sort of unusual. Colonial bread, Marita bread, same door. I was partial to Marita bread, although we ate probably more Colonial at my house. I'm not sure why. But Marita bread brought me the Lone Ranger on the radio, where you use the imagination, and you saw it up here because it wasn't on the TV. See, TV had been invented, it just hadn't gotten to Fort Payne. It was too far up in the hills for there. In fact, at home, I still have a little silver bullet. You remember the Lone Ranger used silver bullets. On the side, it says Marita bread. And if you turn and look it up from the bottom, there's a hole where you put your pencil in and sharpen it. We went in the store. It was a room about the third of the size of this room. There were shelves around all the walls. There were some shelves out through there. There was a door in the back. Through that door was where the man lived. That was his house. I've often thought what a sweet commute You get up in the morning, pull on your pants, open the door, and you're at work. Dad says to the man, could we borrow a couple of bowls and a couple of spoons? And he said, sure. And he went back there in his house to get them. And he went over there to the shelf and he picked up a can of Van Camp's pork and beans. And then he stopped at another place and got one of those little rectangular cans of Possum brand sardines. And then he got a package of sody crackers, or you may know them as saltines. And he said, Mark, get us something to drink. Well, I went over to the ice box, not the refrigerator. It was a red case about that long and about that wide and about that high probably. The top, you lift this end and fold it back, or you lift that end and fold it back. Inside are all these bottled drinks and ice and water where the ice had melted. And Coca-Colas were in little 6.5 ounce bottles. Now they were good. On the bottom of each bottle, there would be stamped the name of a town where that bottle originally was bottled. You know, we were at Fort Payne or Scottsboro, so it might say that, but it might say Birmingham or Nashville or somewhere. And a lot of times the guys, meaning men, would stop for a Coke, and you'd set them out there, and then whoever had the bottle furthest away or the closest, whichever ones they decided, paid for the Cokes. I mean, it cost a nickel a piece, y'all. But for a nickel, I wanted more than 6.5 ounces. So I looked for the tall ones that held 10 ounces, like knee-high or ROC colas. I loved ROC colas. I mean, for a nickel, 10 ounces, that was a deal. So I reached in there and pulled out 2 ROC colas. And as I was going back to where Dad was sitting down there, I looked, and here's this wire rack. There's a package. Moon pies. Deluxe moon pies with 3 cookies and 2 marshmallow fillings. I said, Dad, can we have these for dessert? And he said, well, I think so. So I got 2 of those. Now, I lived in Mobile for 7 years. And I went to lots of Mardi Gras parades. And I would be out there and I'd hear people chanting, moon pie, moon pie. I have yet to see a moon pie be thrown. They were all marshmallow pies. To be a moon pie, you had to be baked in Chattanooga, Tennessee at the Chattanooga Baking Company. They are the official moon pie. Now they distribute all over the country. I was out in Seattle back in August, and I saw moon pies from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Little Debbie cakes, too, from up at Collegedale, Tennessee. And I thought, boy, things have really changed, because then you didn't get moon pies very far away from Chattanooga. Well, Dad had opened that can of pork and beans, and he poured about half in one bowl, and he poured half in the other bowl. Now, remember, it's summertime, it's hot, the room is not air conditioned. The beans don't need to be heated because it's not that cold. And then he took the can of Possum brand sardines, and attached to the bottom of a can was a key. It was sorted on there, and you took the key and broke it loose. And then in the corner of the can was a little lip of tin, which you attached the key to and started to twist. And twisted it, and it just rolled the top of that can of sardines back. Just like if you got up this morning and rolled your bed covers down, that was the way it rolled back. And I looked in that can, and there's a bunch of little fishes, smaller than the ones I'd thrown back all morning long. Well, Dad took about half of those sardines and he put them on top of the beans in one bowl, and the rest of them he put in the other bowl. And he opened up the crackers. And he said the blessing and started to eating. Well, I sat there with my bowl of beans and sardines and my spoon at ready. And I looked at it. And Dad looked at me and said, Mark, I thought you said you were hungry. And I said, yes, sir, I thought I was. Well, he seemed to be enjoying it. So finally, I took the spoon and I got a little piece of fish and some beans on the spoon, and I got a cracker all ready, and I put it in my mouth and started chewing. And ooh, it was so good. It was delicious. I cleaned the bowl. In fact, today at my house, and Scotty would verify for this, we call that redneck gourmet. It is so good. Now, when I came up here to do those 11 summers of camping, that's really when I started telling stories. And one summer, I started telling this story. And I got to thinking about it. You all could cook supper or lunch. Just get you some pork and beans and sardines and crackers. If it's wintertime, now you may want to heat those beans. But if the room is warm, it's not necessary. They eat just as good. Or you could have a picnic. But you know, I grew up and I married a sophisticated lady. And I got away from my redneck gourmet upbringing. And the older brother, Skipper, decided to be an Ivy Leaguer. And he went to Princeton. And it came time for his 21st birthday. We were living in Andalusia. And I wanted to do something special since he's so far away from home that I went down to the Piggly Wiggly. And I bought a can of pork and beans and a can of sardines that no longer had keys on them. I bought a 6-pack of RC Colas. His mother made him a chocolate pound cake. And I put a candle in there. And then I took 3x5 cards and wrote step-by-step instructions as to how to fix a gourmet birthday meal and sent it to him. That candle was to be put in a bottle to have a candlelight dinner and to invite some significant other to have birthday dinner with him. I thought he might invite Brooke Shields because she was sort of a hanger-on to the a cappella group that he sang in up there, the Tiger Tones. In fact, he introduced us. And he danced with her one time, and some of our friends said, well, how is she? Because she's a tall lady. And he said, she's just right. And so they were waiting on the wedding invitations, which never came. Well, he had that birthday dinner, and he still thinks of it every once in a while. I don't think he's passed that on to his daughters yet. We have a 10 and a 2-year-old granddaughters. And then, since we still hadn't done it, old Scott there just went to Auburn like his mom and dad did. And he was over at the Wesley Foundation on his 21st birthday, and we had to do the same thing for him. Well, we finished up that lunch, and we went back out to the river to continue fishing. Well, you know, after you've had lunch, Mike and Gary, how it's nice to rest a while, and some people take naps. Now, I wasn't taking a nap. Actually, what I was doing, I had some concerns about my eyelids, and I was afraid there were some holes or cracks in them. And so I was studying them from the underside. But I was holding that fishing pole, and Dad was off over there, and all of a sudden I felt the pole give a jerk. And I opened my eyes real wide. And then I looked, the bobber just disappeared and the pole started to bend. And I said, Daddy, Daddy, I got a fish. I got a fish. See, I thought he had reached over and grabbed my line and jerked it, but he was too far away. He had long arms, but they weren't that long. And he came over there, and I just knew that pole was going to break because it was bending so. And we got it, and we kept pulling, and we pulled out the biggest old catfish I'd ever seen this side of Silver Springs, Florida. Ooh, he was a beautiful catfish. Now, Daddy caught a lot of fish, but I had caught the biggest fish. Ooh, he was a beautiful fish. And yeah, I never did catch another one. We were there another hour, I guess, and Daddy said, Mark, I think it's time that we head towards home. So we got everything and we put it in the car and got his stringer of fish and put in the car. And I got up in the front seat of that 1940 Chevrolet and I held my big old beautiful fish right there in my lap. As we drove all the way back across Sand Mountain into Fort Payne up on Forest Avenue, well up the driveway into the backyard, stopped in the grass, and Daddy says, if you'll clean these fish, we can have them for supper. Maybe that's why I don't like to go fishing now that I think about it. It seemed like I always got to clean them. Well, I went in the house and I got a bowl and I got a knife and I went out there and got down on the ground and I picked up my big old beautiful fish and I laid it down. I got one of Daddy's fish and I cleaned and filleted it and I picked up my big old beautiful catfish and I laid it down. And I got another one of Daddy's fish and cleaned it, filleted it, and I picked up my big old beautiful fish and I laid it down and I'd cleaned all of Daddy's fish and the bowl was full. So I picked up the bowl and went in the kitchen and I said, Mother, is this enough fish for supper? She says, Law, Mark, that's more than enough fish for supper. And she sat into cooking those fish and French fries and hush puppies and Vidalia onion rings and iced tea. And it was so good, and I just ate, and I got so full, and I was so tired and sleepy because we got up early, and I said, may I be excused to go on bed? And they excused me, and I went, and I got ready for bed, and I went to bed, and I went to sleep, and I just slept like a log all night long until about the crack of dawn. Maybe that's what woke me up. Because I woke up and sat straight up in bed and doggone, I left my fish out there in the backyard. Well, I hopped out of the bed. I didn't bother to get dressed. I just had my pajamas on. I went running out in the backyard. It's just starting to get daylight. I just knew somebody's dog or cat had come and dropped my fish, and I went out there and I looked down and there he was. And I reached down and I picked up my big old beautiful fish. And as the day got brighter, I stood there holding it. Oh, it was a beautiful catfish. It felt like it might still be alive. So I went over beside the house where there was a rain barrel. And I put it down in the rain barrel, and it just laid there on its side on top of the water. But I kept looking at it. It looked like its whiskers were moving. So I grabbed that fish, and I soused it down in the bottom of that barrel. And I turned it loose. And that fish just sort of floated back up to the top of the water. But I don't believe it's lying on its side quite as much. So I got that fish. And I soused it down into the back barrel of water and I turned it loose. And it floated up and laid there on top of the water. So for the third time, I grabbed that fish And I soused it. I soused that fish down in that barrel of rainwater and turned it loose. And it floated back up to the top, but it was floating straight. And as I looked, its whiskers moved. And all of a sudden, the tail went flip, flip. And in just a few minutes, that fish was swimming round and around in that rain barrel. And I thought, Law me, how did that fish live out of water for so long? And the only explanation I was ever able to come up with, there was a very heavy dew that night. Because I remember how wet my feet got. They were barefooted. And how wet the grass was. And that must have been it. Well, it's summertime in Fort Payne, and I didn't have to go to school. And I got to studying. How long do you think a fish could live out of water? I don't know. But the next morning I went out after breakfast and I took him out of the barrel and kept him out for about an hour. And put him back in, and he started into swimming. The next morning I got him out and I kept double the time. I kept him out 2 hours. And I put him back in, and he started into swimming. Well, the third morning I went out and got him, and I kept him out all morning until time for lunch. In fact, that day I got my bicycle. I had a basket on the front of my bicycle. And I got my fish, and I put it up in the basket. And we went riding. I hadn't gone more than about 2 blocks from the house when all of a sudden he took his tail and he flipped and he flopped till he got his chin up on the edge of the basket. And he's looking straight ahead. And the breeze caught his whiskers, and they're going just like this. And he got the biggest old catfish grin you'd ever hope to see. Like, boy, this is really living, you know. Oh, we had the best time. I put him back in. He started into swimming. The next day, I kept him out all day. In fact, we were out there in the yard, and he was out there in the grass. I started off over there to do something, and I heard behind me, flip, 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 flip. Would you believe that he had taken his tail, and he was going flip, flop, and squirming across the grass, following me as I went across the backyard. Sure enough. Finally, I quit putting him back in the barrel. I just left him out. In fact, one night, he was in the house. It was time to go to bed. I didn't put him out. I got into bed and he came flip flop over there to the bed. So I just reached down and got him and picked him up into bed, and he went flip flop and squirmed down and got under the covers. And he slept with me. He slept with me a lot of nights after that. I used to have to tell people when they saw Mother Kathy, don't tell her because I don't think she knew. Well, the kids, my friends, wanted to know what his name was. I said, I don't know. I said, well, you got to name a pet. Yeah, but what kind of name is good enough for a pet catfish? I've never named a pet catfish. And I studied it on it. Now, we went to the First Methodist Church in Fort Payne, whose preacher was Brother Horace. Everybody called him Brother Horace. And I decided if the name was good enough for the Methodist preacher, surely it was a good enough name for my catfish. So I named him Horace. When I spoke of Horace, you knew I was talking about the catfish. When I said Brother Horace, I was talking about the preacher. Well, Horace and I were in the backyard one day, and I got a ball. And I took the ball and I rolled it across to Horace. As it got to Horace, he took his tail and he went flip, and he threw it back to me to catch. And I'd throw it back over there, and he'd take his tail and go flip. catch it, and throw it back. We spent hours that summer playing ball. Went bike riding a lot. We went to play softball one day. They wanted to use Horace as second base, and I drew the line there. But we had the best time all summer long. The problem with summer, it comes to an end. In those days, the first day of school was only a half day. They didn't fire up the lunchroom. And so I told Horace goodbye, that I had to go to school, and I'd be back after a while. And I left, and I went to school. Now, the school in Fort Payne was a long hall with rooms on either side. No air conditioning. Big windows. And on the hall side, there were transoms over the door as well as along the wall of the hall to try to make the air circulate in August and September when it was so hot. I guess I'm in the 4th grade on the hall. And I'm sitting there, and I thought I heard a noise, and I listened, and it sounded like flip-flop, flip-flop, flip. But it would stop. Flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. Flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. Yeah, I heard a noise. Flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. Flip-flop, 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 flip-flop. Flip-flop, 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 flip-flop. And the door is open to let the air circulate. And there in the hall sat Horace, looking in the room. He saw me sitting at the desk, and he goes, flip-flop, 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 flip, right over there under my desk. He had started at the far end of the school, come down the hall, looked in every room until he saw me, and had come over there. You know, my teacher was not that excited about Horace coming to school. She told me I should take him home and make sure he didn't come back anymore. Well, I did. I took him home, and I thought about, what am I going to do? And I guess what I'm going to have to do is tie him up. So the next morning I went out to the garage and got some rope. Using every knot that I'd learned in Cub Scouts, I took my rope and I wrapped it round and 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 round, round and round and round and round and round Horace until he looked like a mummy tied up in rope. And then I took another rope and I tied it to the rope around Horace and tied the other end to the faucet that stuck up in the ground out in the backyard. I want you to know that that was the most miserable looking catfish I had ever seen. All tied up in rope. And I apologized and I said, I am so sorry, but you can't go to school. They don't want you there. You'll have to stay here, but we'll ride bicycles this afternoon when I come back. And I went to school. All day long school. We had lunch in the lunchroom. It's towards the end of the day, and I'm sitting in arithmetic. When I hear in the hall, flip-flop, 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 flip, right to the door, flip-flop, flip-flop, right over my desk, there was Horace. Still tied up in rope from head to toe. There's a piece of rope about that long attached to him. And I figured out what he had done. All day he had sat there and chewed on that rope till he chewed it in two. And then he came on to school. Well, my teacher was no more glad to see him that day than the previous day and says, Mark, you take that fish and go to the principal's office. I picked up Horace. He was still beautiful, wrapped up in rope. And I went to the principal's office. Mr. Gilbert said, Mark, you shouldn't bring that fish to school. You know fish don't belong in school. And you know what I wanted to say? Mr. Gilbert, don't you know fish are always in schools? But I didn't. And he told me to take it home and make sure it never came back again, or I'd be in serious trouble. Well, I tied him up. How in the world am I going to keep him at home? I left him outside that night. If he doesn't know I've gone to school, then he won't go to school. So I got up the next morning, ate breakfast, dressed, went to the front door, opened it very quietly, shut it, it didn't even click. I tiptoed down the steps of the porch. I tiptoed along the sidewalk. Got out of sight of the house, I started to run till I got that catch in my side, and I was walking to school when back behind me I heard flip-flop, 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 flip-flop. How did he know I was gone? But here he came. I came to where there was the fork in the roads, and I always went to the right. I'll fake him off. I'll go to the left. Because you could go to school either way. And I went to the left, and I heard him coming behind me. Flip-flop, 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 flip-flop. And I got to the creek. The creek is the reason I didn't go this way all the time to school. Because the bridge across the creek was one of those iron bridges that had a wooden floor, and not all the boards were in the floor. Some were missing. And I either felt like I was going to fall through or it'd break and fall with me. And I hated to go that way. And I got to the bridge and stopped and looked, but I heard flip-flop, 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 flip-flop coming right behind me. I got to go on. So I went across the bridge, and I'd just gotten across the bridge, and I heard him go flip-flop, 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 flip-flop. And he stopped. I'd hidden over in the weeds on the side of the road, and I thought, Horace is scared to come across that bridge too. And I was just fixing to get up and go, and I heard floom, 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 floom. He was coming across the bridge. Floom, 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 floom. And then all was quiet. And I stood up and I didn't see Horace. And I walked out in the road and looked and I didn't see Horace. And I started to walk up on the bridge. And as I was walking onto the bridge, I still couldn't see him. But I looked where one of those boards was missing. And down on the top of the creek, I saw Horace. And I ran down. I had short pants on. I waded out in the creek. It wasn't very deep. I reached down and I picked up my beautiful catfish. And I held him. And I realized I was too late. Evidently, Horace had been out of water so long that he had forgotten how to swim and had drowned. And I ran back home and left him. And after school, I came home and I got a box and some rags and put him in there and dug a hole back in the backyard on Forest Avenue and buried him. And I never, ever had another pet catfish. And then I came to Blue Lake. And I started storytelling. And I'd have like 100 boys and girls here every week. And I started telling them about Horace. And one day I got an envelope in the mail. And I opened it up. And it was a newspaper picture. Somebody had clipped from the newspaper. And it was a picture of walking catfish down in Florida. And in a ballpoint pen they had written, "Do you think this is some of Horace's great, great, great grandchildren?" And I know exactly that's who they are. Jack. Some stories about Jack include his brother, Will and Tom. Some of you didn't know he had brothers, but he did. But this one doesn't. Almost all the stories about Jack, he's setting out to seek his fortune. This one is one of those. He told his mom one day that he thought he'd leave home tomorrow and set out and seek his fortune. Would she fix him something to eat? The next morning, she fixed him a breakfast and fixed him a little old poke of lunch. And he got it, and he took off down that path. Now, you know Jack lived way up in the mountains up there in the Appalachians. And he went down that path till it became a wider path. And he walked down that path till it became sort of a little road. And he kept walking until it became even more a firm packed road. And he kept walking until he was plumb out of the settlement, which he knew. And he was starting to get hungry, so he stopped over there by a spring and sat down by a tree and opened that poke up and ate them biscuits and ham that his mother had put in there and drank him some spring water and then started on down the road again. Till he came to a settlement which he didn't know. He hadn't been there before. There were some houses and there was a grist mill. And he walked up to the grist mill and said to the man, "Howdy." The man said, "Howdy." He said, "My name's Jack and I've set out to seek my fortune. And I was wondering if you had any work I could do." Well, the man looked Jack up and down and said, "Well, I've been looking for somebody to run this grist mill. You ever run a grist mill?" He says, "Why, law me, that's about all I ever did back home." Now, Jack had been to a grist mill, yeah, but he wasn't always the most truthful of fellers. He said, "Well, Jack, I guess I could hire you to run it, and when can you start?" And Jack says, "Well, I can start right now." And he says, "Well, okay, I'll let you." And then he stopped Jack and he said, "Jack, I want to be perfectly honest with you. Everybody that I've hired to run this grist mill, when I come back down here the next day, I found them dead." But Jack paused. He said, "Oh, well, that don't bother me none. I'm not afraid of it. Yeah, I'll take your job." And so he sat in grinding the corn right then in the mill. He ground until it was all done. And he went out there and he closed the sluice gate to keep the water from going through and turning the wheel. Went back to the stream. He walked back in there and was thinking about, "Boy, I sure am hungry. I hope there's something around here for supper." And there, a little old man, a little old short guy, long scraggly beard, longer and stringier than mine, tattered clothes, long gray tattered coat on. He said, "Howdy, Jack." Jack said, "Howdy, stranger." He said, "I was wondering if you could grind this little meal, corn here into some meal for me." Jack says, "Why, sure, I'll be happy to, Daddy." And he runs up there and opens the sluice gate so the water can through, and that big old wheel starts to turn and the stones start to grind each other, and he grabs that sack of corn. He goes in there and pours it through the little funnel hole till it gets in between those rocks, and those rocks rub against it. And grinds up the corn, and he gets over there in the same sack. He catches the meal as it comes out, ties it up, hands it back to the old timer, runs up, closes the gate again, stops the wheel turning, comes back. The man says, "Jack, I sure do appreciate you's the firstest one's been willing to help me. I want to give you something." Jack says, "No, that's not necessary, Daddy. You don't have to do that." "No, I want to." And he reaches down under his coat and he pulls his hand out, and it is a big knife, a silver knife. And he gives it to Jack. Jack says, "Oh, you don't have to do that." "Yeah, I want to do that." "Well, I thank you." And the old timer leaves. Jack goes on in the grist mill there. It was probably a room maybe almost this long, but not quite this wide. There was a fireplace down there in the end with the turning the stones and so forth up in this end. And Jack was going to work and live there. Cook his meal right there in the fireplace. Now, it was up high. There were 12 windows 6 on this side and 6 on this side. It was a full moon night. And there's a fire in the fireplace, so it's almost as much light in there as it is in the daytime, but it has gotten dark. He goes over and he finds some meat, and he takes that silver knife and he slices that meat. He puts it in a skillet and starts cooking it there in the fireplace. He's watching his meat cook there, and he has some bread. Sort of hurry, you know, he's hungry, like that meat to finish cooking. And you realize it's gotten dark. And he looks around and looks up, and there's a black cat sitting in each of those 12 windows. Well, he doesn't think a lot about it. He goes back to his cooking, and he hears a thump, and looks, and one of those black cats has jumped down to the floor. And it just comes walking like cats do over there to the fire and sits down beside Jack at the fire, staring into it. Its tail just sort of twitching. And as the meat cooks, the cat's paw comes up and reaches towards the meat, and the cat says, "Sop Doll." And Jack says, "Don't you sop your doll in my skillet." And the cat stops and sort of stirs and still sits there, though. A little minute passes, and he reaches out again. "Sop Doll!" And Jack grabs his knife and said, "I told you not to sop your doll in my skillet. You do that again, I'm going to cut it off." Well, that cat sort of got up and turned around in a circle, and the ones up above stirred a little bit. They sat back down and stares at the meat cooking in the fire. And all of a sudden, that cat goes, "Sop Doll!" and reaches for the skillet, and at the same time Jack pulls that silver knife, he cuts that cat's paw off. The cat goes, "Yow!" and is gone, and all the cats jump out of the windows and are gone. And he turns back around and he looks there in the skillet. There's not a cat's paw in that skillet. There's a woman's hand. It's even got a ring on the finger. Well, he takes that hand, he goes over there and finds a gunny sack. He puts the hand in it, wraps it up, lays it over in the corner. He goes out and throws that meat away, and he scours that skillet real good, and he slices some more, and he cooks it, and he eats his supper, and he goes to bed and sleeps well. The next morning, the man which owns the meal, he wakes up and he said, "Oh, woman, how about fixing me some breakfast? I got to go down to the mill. I'm afraid I'm going to have a burying today." The old one said, "Well, I don't feel very good. You better go fix your own breakfast." So he goes in there and opens up the old pie safe, and yeah, there's some biscuits in there, a piece of ham and a piece of chicken left over from yesterday. So he makes do for his breakfast, and he goes back in the bedroom. "Well, old woman, I'm going down to the mill. You feel any better?" "No." "Well, I'll check on you later." And he left. And he's walking down to where the mill is. He walks along. He's thinking, "Oh, where will I bury Jack?" And then he hears the rumble of the water wheel. And he gets there, and old Jack's just running around, and the water wheel's going, and he's grinding corn. The man says, "Well, Jack, I sure is proud to see you. I was just sure I was going to have a burying today." Jack said, "Well, it won't be me. I feel great. But you know, something peculiar happened here last night." And when he got a chance and there was a break, he stopped the water wheel and he started to tell the man about it. And he went over there in the corner and he got that gunny sack and he unrolled it. And there's that woman's hand with the ring on the finger laying there. The old man says, "Jack, I think I need you to come with me. Let's go up to the house." And so they went up to his house, and he walked on in and went back to the red room. And, "Old woman, how you feeling?" "Oh, I don't feel good at all." "Well, is there anything I can do for you?" well, maybe you could get some of the neighbor ladies to come sat with me. Well, who do you want to come sat with you? And she started to name them. And she named 11 ladies. Well, he sent for those ladies, and he came back in the bedroom, and he said, "Oh, woman, show me your hand." And she pulled her hand out from the cover and showed him his hand. Said, "Now, woman, show me your other hand." And she wiggled around under the covers and brought the hand out. He said, "No, woman, I want to see your other hand," and grabbed her arm and jerked it out from under the covers, and there wasn't a hand on it. And he put it down, and by then those old ladies had started to arrive. And they came on back into the red room, and they made a circle around the bed there. And the man said, "Jack, you come with me." And they got to the front room. There was a fire in the fireplace, and he reached down in that fireplace and pulled out a couple of burning brands. And they went outside, and he started going one way and sent Jack the other way around the house, setting the house on fire. And they stood there, and they watched that house burn with all those ladies in it, until there wasn't anything left but smoldering ashes. The old man said to Jack, "You know, Jack, we sure have had a lot of trouble with witches in this settlement. But they tell me there hasn't been any more trouble since that day." John was called Wicked John for a reason. You can probably guess what the reasons are. He was a blacksmith by trade. So he was a big, strong, burly kind of guy who had and continued to be in trouble. One day, he was working in his blacksmith shop when he glanced up at the door, and there stood a fella, shabbily dressed, old, I guess much like the guy who had visited Jack. He was standing over there, and John said, "Hey, old timer, come on in and have a seat." Now, John had him a rocking chair there in his blacksmith shop where he'd sit down and rest every so often. He said, "Come on, have a seat." The man came over and sat down. John continued to work, but he looked at him every so often. Said, "Old timer, you look like you might be hungry. Would you like something to eat?" The man nodded. Yeah, he was hungry. So Jack lived up the hill there just a short piece. He went out, went up to the house. It was in the afternoon. They'd had a good lunch, so he got him a tin plate, and he put a big old piece of fried chicken on there, and some turnip greens, some sliced tomatoes, and some beans, and some potato salad, and some cornbread, and a big tall glass of buttermilk. And he came on back down there and he gave it to the old timer, who sat there in a rocking chair and started to eat. And he ate like, it'd been a good while since he'd had anything to eat. John was sort of proud to see how well he was eating. But he continued to work, and then he looked up, and the old man wasn't there anymore. In his place, there was now a big, tall, virile-looking, whatever the word is, virile, looking man in long, white, flowing robes. And he said, "John, I'm Gabriel. And every few years I come down here to see if there are any good men left on this earth. You have been so kind to me, I want to grant you 3 wishes. Anything you want, and it'll be yours." John said, "Oh, Lord, me, 3 wishes. What do I wish for?" That rocking chair No, first it was his sledgehammer. That sledgehammer I've been using. You know, after school, some of them old boys come by here and they'll get my sledgehammer and they'll take it out there across the road and they'll bust up rocks with it and leave it out there. I just wish that anybody who picked up my sledgehammer would have to hang on to it until I said they could let go. Well, Gabriel looked at him and said, why, sure, that's the way it'll be. But you could tell from looking at him that he thought, man, you sure are wasting wishes. Now, that's one wish, you got two more. Law me, two more wishes. Yeah, two more. Oh, the rocking chair there. You know, people come in here and they'll sit down there and I get tired and I want to sit down and they're sitting there and they won't get up. And I just wish that anybody who sits in that rocking chair would have to sit there until I said they could get up. He said, okay, John, that's the way it'll be. You got one more wish now, don't you waste it. One more wish as he looks around the shop and then towards the door. And outside the door there's this firethorn bush with the pretty blossoms on it and thorns on it. He said, you know, Gabriel, that firethorn bush out there, those fox hunters come by here in their fancy duds and they're always reaching in that bush and breaking off a switch. And I just wish that anybody that tries to break something off of that bush, I just wish you'd grab them and hold them until I said they could turn them loose. And Gabriel says, okay, that's your three wishes. That's the way it'll be. And Gabriel disappeared and was gone. John sort of forgot about it until one day his old lady got really upset with him, which was not terribly unusual, but she got really upset with him. She got so mad she said, John, I just wish the devil would come up here and take you away from here and I'd never have to look at your ugly face again. Well, John laughed and went on back down to the blacksmith shop and he's working in there. He's working on a wagon wheel when he notices the shadow in the door and he looks and there's a little guy about so tall standing over there. He had a couple of bumps right up here. And he looked down at his feet, and there weren't no shoes down there. They looked like cloven hooves. And it looked like there was a tail that twitched out from behind him every once in a while. And the little guy said, John, you come on and go with me. Daddy said for me to come get you. Now you come on, let's go. John says, oh, am I supposed to go with you? Yeah, come on and go now. Well, I tell you, I'll go with you, but I'm working on this wagon wheel here. Let me just finish this wagon wheel, and then I'll go with you. And you know, he's holding the wheel with one hand, and he's hammering with the other one. And so the little devil come over there and watched him, and he said, here, let me help you get through quicker. And he took the sledgehammer, and he'd hammer, and John had turned the wheel. He'd hammer, and John had turned the wheel until they had the wheel finished. And he set it aside and got another one. He said, no, I didn't say you could do another one. But about that time, the hammer came down again and again. Till pretty soon, the hammer got faster and faster and faster, and that little devil's feet started to fly up off the floor as the hammer went down. John, make this hammer let me go. John says, if I make that hammer let you go, do you promise that you'll never come back and bother me no more? Oh, John, I'll never come back no more. Okay, you could go, and there was a cloud of dust down the road as that little devil departed. Oh, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks went by. His old woman got in another fit. She got mad at him again. I just wish, John, that I would never have to look at your face again. I just wish the devil would come take you away from here. Well, John's down there working on horseshoes when there's a shadow at the door, and he looks, and there's a guy about this tall, but he looks a lot like that other guy that had been there. Cloven hooves, little tail. John, Daddy sent me to get you. He said for me to get you and come on right back now. Well, I got to go with you now? Yeah, you got to go now. Well, I really need to finish these horseshoes, and then I'll go with you. So he continued to work on the horseshoe, and the devil walked in, and he was waiting, and he walked over there by the rocking chair, and he sat down in the rocking chair, waiting for John to finish with the horseshoes. And John finished the horseshoes and picked up something else to do, and the devil said, "Hold on, John, you can't do anything else, we got to go." And he tried to get up. But instead of getting up, that chair rocked faster and faster and faster, till pretty soon the back of his head was hitting the back of the chair. Whippity-cut, whippity-cut, whippity-cut. "John, let me out of this chair, let me out of this chair." "If I let you out of that chair, you promise to go away and never come back, never bother me no more." "Oh, John, please let me out of this chair. I'll never bother you again. I'll never come back." So he let him go, and there was a bigger cloud of dust down the road. 2 days later, his old woman still hadn't cooled off. "I just wish, John, the pure old devil himself would come in here and take you away from me." And he laughed at her, and that made her mad. And as he stepped out of the door, she picked up a stick of stove wood and flung it at him, and he shut the door, and the wood went right through the window. Made her even madder. He went on back down there and he had barely gotten in the shop. In fact, I don't think it even started anything when it got dark in the shop. And he looked up, and here's a big dude who stooped to get through the door. There were horns, big cloven hooves, a big tail. "John, John, come with me. It's time to go." John said, "Well, devil, I'll go with you, but I got to finish this here." "John, you're going with me now." "Well, how about helping me get the hammer?" "John, you got to go. We'll just sit down in the rocking chair." "John, you got to go with me." And about that time, he reached out and grabbed the front of his overalls. Now, John, remember, is a blacksmith. He's a big and muscular guy, and decided that he was not ready to go with the devil. And he started to put up a fight. And the dust was flying up from the floor as they fought and fought. But John was losing as they got closer and closer to the door. And as they got out the door, the devil reached over into the firethorn bush to grab a thorny switch to switch John with, when the firethorn bush grabbed the devil and sucked him head first down into that bush, and he struggled mightily. "Oh, ow, oh, ow, let me out of here!" And finally all was quiet, and all was still, and John heard, "John, John, please let me out of here." John said, "Devil, if I let you out of here, you promise to go away, never bother me no more?" "Oh, I'll never bother you anymore, John. Please let me out of here." "Not you, not any of your sons will ever come back and bother me no more." "Oh, John, we'll never, ever bother you no more." And so John told the bush to release the devil, who raised a big cloud of dust as he departed down the road. Years passed. His old woman still got mad at him, but nothing happened. And then the day came when John departed this life and found himself at the pearly gates. "John, what are you doing here?" "Well, I thought I might have some chance of getting in here." So he opened up the book of life and started to show John, yes, there were some entries over here on the good side. But on the side of the bad deeds, there was page after page after page after page of the wicked things that John had done. John, you don't stand a chance to get in here. You might as well go that way. So John took off that way, going down the road. And as he walked in a little while, he could see some clouds of smoke. And then he started to smell some sulfur. And he saw a red glow. And in front of the red glow, there was an iron bar fence. And there was the gate standing wide open and welcoming. As he walked on towards it, he saw little people running around. And finally one stopped and looked. And he heard a voice saying, "Daddy, Daddy, come here. Come here, Daddy." And he saw this big old devil come to the entrance and look out there and see John and say, "Bar the door, boys, bar the door." And so they shut the gate and John walked on up. And the devil says, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, they wouldn't let me in up there. They said I had to come here." The devil said, "No, John, you ain't getting in here." John says, "Well, what am I going to do?" And the devil thought, and he reached over and he got him an iron bucket. And he got some tongs and got some hot coals and he dropped into that iron bucket. And he handed it out through the bars and gave it to John and said, "Here, John, you go start a hell of your own." Now, when I lived down here in South Alabama, sometimes late in the evening, late afternoon, early evening, we'll be out in the woods, maybe around here in the Kanaka National Forest. And you'd look out there and you could see a light. And that light seemed to move. And I heard some of the people say, "Oh, that's a will-o'-the-wisp." Or somebody else would call it a jack-o'-lantern. But now I've shared with you the story so that you and I both know what that light is. That's just John looking for a place to start a hell of his own. When I was a little boy, like 3, we went to visit Granddaddy. He was a pretty smart man. He was a frugal man. For those who don't know what frugal means, it's not stingy, but it means, unlike Scotty, you don't have to be the first one on the block to get it. In fact, he still used his old muzzle-loading rifle. I mean, lots of new guns were along, but he'd used this one all along. Why change? It still shot. It still killed game. He said, "Mark, would you like to go hunting with me?" "Oh, yes, Granddaddy." Remember, I'm a toddler. The next morning, Grandmother fixed us a wonderful breakfast. Had biscuits instead of shingle toast. I love the toast here, though. I was so glad to come back. It had been so long since I've had the toast. But they were big old cat's head biscuits. We had biscuits and sausage and ham and eggs and so forth. Then Grandmother fixed us up some lunch. And for lunch, she took the breakfast biscuits that were left over and put ham in some and sausage in some. But the best ones were the ones that she took her finger and she stuck a hole in the edge of it. And then she'd swirl her finger around, making a little indenture inside that biscuit. And take some sorghum molasses and pour through there and mash it shut. Now, a Krispy Kreme jelly-filled donut is pretty good. but it does not compare to one of Grandmother's sorghum-filled biscuits. And she put a couple of peaches in for dessert. And we started out hunting. And we walked around all morning long. And we didn't see anything. Not a squirrel, not a rabbit, just some songbirds. And we came to a clearing that was a little bigger than this room is. And over in this end down here, there was a big log. And Granddaddy says, Mark, let's go over here and sit down and let's eat that lunch. And so we walked over there and sat down on that log and opened up that poke and got those biscuits out and ate them. And then got those peaches and ate them. Now, Granddaddy had one vice, and that was, a vice is something that you do that you really shouldn't. He smoked a pipe. It was one of those long, white clay stem pipes. And he filled the bowl with tobacco and he lit it, and he was sitting there smoking. We heard this noise in the opposite end of the clearing. Well, actually in the woods at the opposite end down there. It was, I don't know, it sounded like a tank or something coming through the woods. And the trees sort of started to move. And then all of a sudden it parted. And there stood the biggest buck deer that I have ever seen. It must have had like 67 points on it. His antlers went everywhere. And it came on out. And evidently the wind was just right because he didn't notice as he started to graze, bobbing his head there. Now, Granddaddy had laid his hand on my knee for me to be quiet, be still, and he picked up his rifle. Now, this is the strange part to me. We'd gone hunting, and yet he carried a muzzle loader that wasn't loaded. I decided it must have been because I was so young, he was afraid I would get hurt. And so he takes out his powder horn and pours the powder down the barrel, moving slowly, quietly. He takes the wadding and rams it down there. And then he reaches for that little bag, leather bag that's on his belt with the bullets that he molds himself. And he picks up the bag, and there's a hole in the seam, and there are no bullets in it. They've all fallen out. And he looks on the ground to see if there are any bullets that might have fallen out there, but he doesn't see any. So he reaches down and picks up that peach seed. And he takes that peach pit, and it just barely goes down the barrel. And he rams it down. Now the deer has been moving a little closer to us as it comes. He raises that muzzle loader and he sights across there, and all of a sudden it's BAM! And there's smoke. And that deer took like one step and went down. And we went running over there, and I'm looking down at the deer who, I guess you call it as a fart, is a huge lump here, and there's a cut, and there's blood pouring down, and I'm looking at how big that deer is and how big its antlers are, and all of a sudden that deer's eyelids flutter. And his eyes open, and he sees us, and he just springs up and jumps and is gone. He got away. What a terrible day. One of the most disappointing days I've ever had. If I remember correctly, Granddaddy did get a rabbit, and Grandmother made a little stew. But that's really not the end of the story. Because a year later, we went to see Granddaddy again, and he said, Mark, do you want to go hunting? And I said, yes, sir. And so the next morning, we had breakfast, and Grandmother made our lunch with those biscuits and put a couple of apples in for dessert. And we went traipsing through the woods and didn't see anything but songbirds. And we came to a clearing, and I looked around and I saw the log down there. Granddaddy, isn't this where we ate lunch last year? Why, Mark, I believe it is. Well, could we go eat lunch again? Well, I don't see why not. So we went over there and sat on the log and opened up that poke and got out those biscuits and started to eat. We hadn't even gotten to the apples when there was this noise on the far end of the clearing. It looked like the trees were moving as all of a sudden they parted, and there stood the biggest buck deer I have ever seen with this huge rack of antlers. And right between the antlers, there's a tree growing. I detect skeptics in the audience. It was a peach tree. As the deer wandered on into the clearing there, Granddaddy had the gun loaded this time. As the deer came closer, he took aim. Finally, there was a BAM! And smoke. And Granddaddy jumped up and I jumped up and we headed out over there. That deer had fallen in place. This time he had his hunting knife out. And as we got there, he made sure he dispatched that deer to the happy hunting ground. Oh, that was the biggest deer. I don't know, seemed to me like we got about 300 pounds of deer meat off of it. We had deer steaks and deer burgers. Oh, it was all so good. Would you believe in that peach tree? There were also a couple of squirrels and 3 doves. And he got those. But the tree was loaded with ripe peaches. There was almost a bushel of peaches on there. And we picked those peaches too. It was an unusually good peach cobbler that Grandmother made. Best one I ever tasted. And the rest she made into peach preserves. I got to say that that's probably the best day of hunting that I've ever had. And for you skeptics, I have a picture. When we lived in Mobile, I carried this picture in my billfold. Some of you will remember that the fair was not always at the fairgrounds, but it was over at the Hartwell Fields. Is that what it's called? I couldn't remember. I just remember it was a baseball park. And our youth ministry had a food booth. And it was my pleasure to go over there every evening to work in the food booth. But one evening, my pocket was picked and my billfold was stolen. Fortunately, the next day, they called me. They had found it in a trash can. The money and postage stamps were gone. Everything else was still in it, including the picture. And I thought, how fortunate. But I've got to quit carrying that picture with me. And so I took it out, and it's in a box. And I'm not sure which box it's in since we made the move. But what it is a picture of that log over there in the end of the clearing where all of this absolutely took place. I noticed this morning about 6 o'clock somebody getting their bicycle out to go riding. And that reminded me of Granddaddy. He was a bicycle rider. He had a car and he had horses and buggy, wagon. But he liked to ride a bicycle. Now, I told you he was a frugal man. He enjoyed reading the paper. But why subscribe to it when they take one at the library? You can go read it for free. So one day, he went out to the barn to get on his bicycle. It was one of those old bicycles with the front wheel about yay high and the little bitty wheel following behind. I mean, it got him there. Why get another bicycle? And he started to get on his bicycle. I didn't see this. I've only been told about it. In fact, they tell me that out there they still talk about it on a cold winter's night as they sit around the fireplace. Or on a hot summer's days, they sit out on the porch or under a shade tree. The famous bicycle ride my granddaddy made. Before he got on his bicycle, he took out that pipe and he filled it full of tobacco and he lit it. And he climbed on the bike and started that leisurely 5-mile ride straight into town to the library. Now, there wasn't any curves in the road, really. There was some ups and downs, but it didn't go this way. As he rode along, he would wave to people on their porch or out in the field. As he got almost to the city limits, he looked up and there was one of those dark black clouds, one of those sudden summer thunderstorms. The kind that dropped so much rain so fast that one drop would fill a bucket. He looked at his pipe. It was only half burnt. If it got wet, that's going to ruin the rest of the tobacco in there and he'd have to throw it away. So in the middle of the road, he made a U-turn and headed back. Gonna get home before he got rained on. Now this time he wasn't leisurely riding. In fact, he was putting everything into it as he got faster and faster and bent over, pedaling it as fast as he could. He had that pipe clenched in his teeth, the smoke going back over his shoulder like a steam engine on the railroad. Granddaddy had a long, wispy beard. If he wore a tie, you wouldn't know it because his beard would cover it up. The wind caught that beard. It was going over the other shoulder as he rode faster and faster, but the rain was coming, getting closer and closer and closer until he suddenly felt it right back here on his back. Now he stuck his pipe out even straighter front ahead and pedaled that much harder. Now, they say, I find this very hard to believe, but they say it rained so hard, so fast, that his front wheel was kicking up the dust while his back wheel was splashing in the mud. But he made it home. And he wheeled straight into the barns. Fortunately, the door was not shut. And he turned around and he sat there on his bicycle seat and finished smoking his pipe while the rain continued to fall. Now, he was soaking wet. From here down, from the rain, from here up, from the perspiration. And that's the story of my granddad's famous bicycle ride. Old Rony was a good old mare. Lived a long time ago. Back up in those Appalachian mountains again. She lived with a couple who he didn't like to do anything but hunt and maybe fish a little bit. And he did grow a few oats to have something to feed to old Rony. Now it was the middle of winter time, and there's snow on the ground, and it is bitterly cold, when his old woman reaches into the salt gourd and hits bottom. The salt is all gone. Old man, you might as well hitch up old Rony and go across the mountain to the settlement and get some salt. I ain't going to be eating unsalted meat around here. And while you're at it, you might as well get some cornmeal, because I touched the bottom of the barrel and the biscuit flour is gone. And it seemed like, oh, the baking soda is low. Well, I'll go directly. But he wasn't studying about going at all. Oh man, you better get on up and get on out of here. Well, I'll go directly. And he got up to go get him some powder for his muzzle loader to go hunting. Long rifle, hog rifle. But the powder was all gone. Blame. I guess I'll have to go to the settlement. And he goes to the door and he whistles for old Rony. And old Rony comes up to the door and he throws the saddle over and gives her a bag of oats to eat. He puts on his big old coat, heavy as it is, and his hat, collar turned up, finishes eating oats. He climbs up on her back. Doesn't even say anything. Oh, Rony's such a good old mare. She knows it must be time to go to the settlement. So with the snow falling down, she takes up climbing the mountain. They get to the top of the mountain. They go down till they get to the settlement. He goes in with some of the furs that he has to trade, and he sets into trading. And let's see, what all did he get? He got, I think it was a 50-pound bag of salt. He got 2 big old bags of flour and 2 more of cornmeal. He got 3 cans of baking soda. He got 2 casks of gunpowder, 50 pounds of bars of lead because he molded his own bullets, and got a few things for his old lady. He packs them all together and takes them out there to old Rony, and he throws it up that pack on her back. I mean, that's a pretty good load, but old Rony just says, okay. Climbs in the saddle and they start off. Now he'd already plugged the bung in one of those gunpowder barrels and filled his powder horn and loaded his gun. And as he was going up the mountain, he looked over there and there was a deer. His gun was loaded. He aimed that old hog rifle. Bam! That deer fell. So he just got off and went over there and cut the strops on the legs of the deer and got them together. Went over, tied it on the horn of the saddle and eased away. Old Rony started on up the mountain. Well, they were near the top of the mountain when he looked, and in the middle of the trail was a big old black bear. Well, he might as well take it. So he'd already loaded his gun. He aimed that hog rifle. Bam! He done killed him a bar. He dragged it up on the upside of the trail there and rode old Rony over there. Got hold of that bear, attached it to the other side from the deer to the horn, and eased away from the bank till the bear swung in and hit old Rony on the side. No, Rony, she's a good old mare. But she looked back over her shoulder back there at the old man. I mean, this was quite a load she's got. But she's a good old mare. So she starts on up the mountain. And as they reach the top, he stops to let her breathe a bit. And there's a little dove right up there in the tree overhead. Well, his wife would like some fresh meat. So he takes his gun and aims and shoots the dove that just falls right down where he can catch it. And don't you know, as he caught that dove, all of a sudden he heard something snap. And he scrunched down. Old Rony's back, done broke, done give out. Oh, Lord, what's he going to do? Got all that stuff. Well, fortunately, he is at the top of the mountain. It's downhill all the way. So he steadies, and then he gets off old Rony. Oh, she was a good old mare. And he takes his knife and he slits her right down the front. And then he slits her legs. And he slips up behind her with some brush. And he hits her on the rump with the brush. And hollers real loud. And Rony jumped. And don't you know, she jumped right out of her skin. And so he takes the 4 legs and ties them all up together. And he gets them up over his head. And he starts off dragging that pack wrapped in Rony's skin down the mountain till he gets to his cabin through all that snow. He walks in, opens the door, goes over to the fireboard, gets his pipe and tobacco because he hadn't forgot it. He hadn't had any all day. And he sets into smoking and pacing back and forth across the room. And the old lady says, "Oh, man, what's the matter?" "Oh, old Rony's up there on the top of the mountain with her broke back." "Well, don't you think you ought to take that pack off?" And so he does it loose, and they unpack everything, and it's bedtime, and they get into bed and sleeping soundly. When the old woman wakes up, she hears a sound, something pawing at the door. "Old man, you wake up." "What?" "Old Rony's at the door." "Oh, no, old Rony's up there on top of the mountain with her back broke." He settles down and goes back to sleep. There's a pawing at the door again. "Old man, wake up. I tell you, Rony's at the door." "No, old Rony's not at the door. I told you he's on top of the mountain." And then there's a pawing and a nicker. "Oh, man, I know that's old Rony at the door. Now you get up." So he gets up. He throws a firebrand on the fire to make it blaze out. And he opens the door, and sure enough, there's old Rony standing there. No skin, just shivering blue from the coldest cold. And he knows what he's got to do. So he reaches behind the door and fumbles around and gets the skin, and he goes out there and he tries to stretch the skin back over old Rony. But it doesn't fit. He keeps trying to stretch it, and then he remembers there's some blackberry vines right there beside the porch steps. And he reaches down there and gets them and twists them together into a wreath, and he ties that skin on old Rony. And he gives her some feed. And he goes back in and gets under the cover. Now the next morning, it's daylight. It's still snow and cold. But he goes out to check on old Rony. And he sees what a terrible bauble he's made. He didn't get old Rony's skin. There was a skin from a sheep that he had killed a few days before that he had picked up and had on that horse, and that's why it wouldn't fit. So he tried to take it off, but don't you know it had already set to and was growing, and it's so cold that he just left it on her, which was a wonderful mistake. Now, old Rony still was very swayback. But that sheepskin grew, and it produced wool that he could shear twice. Produced more wool than 40 sheep would. And the thing his wife liked, when it was blackberry time, just whistle up old Rony. and go out there and pick the blackberries off to make the cobbler. And that's the story of old Rony. She was a good old mare. A long time ago, before we had such wonderful welfare programs and child care programs and things to look after people, there was a little boy about your age who lived with his mother because his daddy had died. And it was just the two of them. And they were very poor. They lived in the mountains on a farm. And they just barely had enough to eat. They were so poor that very seldom did they have any meat to eat. The little boy was not a real good hunter because he was so young. And that's what you had to do, is have grain, have game, kill game to hunt. And one day he was out plowing. He was going to plant the corn, to raise some corn. And the plow was pulled by a mule. And he was walking along behind the mule plowing, and he got to think about, boy, I sure am hungry. I sure hope Mother has something good for supper tonight. Oh, I'm so hungry. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had some meat tonight? Oh, it would taste so good. Oh, I sure am hungry. Oh, meat would taste so good. And as he plows, all of a sudden he realized, he's sort of daydreaming, you know, he's just following the mule. And as he's daydreaming, he realized the plow hit something. And out of his peripheral vision, his side vision, he saw something go scurry away. And he stopped. And he looked down on the ground by the plow. And he reached down on the ground and he picked up a big, hairy toe. It even had a crooked toenail on it. Meat, he thought. And he takes his overall pocket and he drops it down in there. And he goes on plowing. Oh yeah, it'll soon be supper time. And he goes back and forth, and it gets about dark like this. And he unhitches the mule and takes it to the barn and gives it some corn and goes in the house and said, Mama, is supper ready yet? No, son, not yet. It'll be a little while longer. And she went out on the porch to get some water. And while she was out, she had a big pot of beans in the fireplace on the fire there cooking. He ran over there, reached into the pocket of his overalls, pulled out that big, hairy toe with the crooked toenail, lifted up the top on the beans, dropped it in there, stirred it in, put the top on, and was sitting back over there at the table when Mama came back in. Well, a little bit she got the cornbread and served it, got it out, let it cool a little bit. And then she said, I believe the beans should be ready now. And she got that pot of beans and put them on the table. And they both reached in there and got beans on their plate and some cornbread and said the blessing and started in to eating. The little boy says, Mama, these beans are unusually good tonight. Did you put some meat in these beans? His mother said, no, son, I didn't have any meat to put in the beans, but they do taste good, don't they? he says, well, Mama, you must be an unusually good cook because these beans taste like they have meat in them. Well, you know, with a compliment like that, what Mama's going to say? Son, did you put any meat in these beans? She just said, son, these beans do taste good tonight, don't they? Well, they finished eating them, and they went to bed. And his room was upstairs in the house. And he got in that old four-poster feather bed, and he pulled the quilt up, and he went to sleep. But during the night, he woke up, and he listened because he thought he heard something way down in that field where he'd been plowing. It sounded like something, who's got my hairy toe? Oh, I guess it's indigestion, he thought to himself. And rolled over on the other side and went back to sleep. But he hadn't been asleep long when he woke up, because a little closer to the house, he heard something saying, who's got my hairy toe? Well, he just pulled that quilt right on up over his head. And he laid there trying to go back to sleep. But out near the front porch, he heard something that sounded like, who's got my hairy toe? This was not a happy little boy. And he was laying there, sort of shivering under that quilt. Nothing was exposed. If you looked at the quilt, you'd see it shake every once in a while. Because right outside the front porch, front door, on the porch, he heard a voice say, who's got my hairy toe? He started scooting towards the foot of the bed, piling that quilt further on top of him. And he heard the front door go click. And then he heard steps on the steps coming upstairs till it got to the top of the steps, right outside the door to his bedroom. He heard this voice say, who's got my hairy toe? He was just a ball, all scrunched up, wrapped up in the quilts at the foot of that feather bed. This time it was easy to see the quilts shaking. He heard his door go click. And he sensed that something was walking into the room. And right at the foot of the bed, hovering right above him, he heard, who's got my hairy toe? You do! Now, some of us are a little young, And we get a little scared sometimes when we go to bed at night. But you know what I found out? And I would have told the campers from Dolphin Way this when we came, but I hadn't learned it yet. It was only after I started doing all these camps at Blue Lake. There's a lady that lives in Selma. She knows a whole bunch of ghosts. Her name is Catherine Tucker Wyndham. In fact, a ghost named Jeffrey lives at her house. Jeffrey. And if you go to your library, probably at school, you can probably find one or more books about her. Like there's the book called Jeffrey and 13 Alabama Ghosts. Jeffrey and 13 Georgia Ghosts. Jeffrey and 13 Southern Ghosts. There's just a whole bunch of books. Well, she came over here, and she came and did a family camp for me over there in those cabins at Dogwood. And it was Halloween. And we listened to ghost stories. And she told us what to do so we never had to be afraid when we went to bed at night. Even if you sleep on the top bunk, when you go to bed at night, you take off your shoes, you put them on the floor at the edge of the bed, but you turn the shoes so that one faces under bed and the other faces in the opposite direction, sitting side by side. The question is, why do you do that? You do that to keep anything from coming in to bother you during the night. If a ghost or ghoulie or goblin or whatever you want to call it should come into your room at night, it walks in there and looks down and sees the shoes. One's going that way, one's going that way. And he looks down there and says, I wonder if she is coming or is she going? And keeps studying over it until the next thing the sun starts to come up. And nothing can bother you when the sun comes up, so it has to go away. And you know, for 11 summers, I would every week tell the campers that's what they should do over there in the bottom bunk and the top bunk. Both pairs of shoes should be under the edge of the bunk. One shoe going one way, the other one right beside it going the other way. And you know, I never had anything happen to a camper yet. They were all safe all week long when they were here. And another bunch of campers would come in and do that. And they'd come to me and report back to me, nothing bothered me last night.
Wow, nothing bothers me.
So, if you have a concern that something might, if there's a boogeyman under your bed at home, you do that to your shoes, and I promise you that boogeyman will not come out and bother you in the bed. Not ever. One other story. Oh, this is November the 1st. This morning, this is something else Catherine taught us. This morning, you should wake up. Before you get up or get out of bed, you should holler, rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. And you'll have good luck all month long until the next first of the month. But it doesn't work if you get out of bed and say it. You got to say it while you're still in bed. So I hope maybe you can retain that so that on December the 1st, you can do it. That morning, from those cabins in Dogwood, which are not as soundproof as the rooms in Oakwood, we heard, rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. Getting dark. They'd throw a little light on the subject. There was a family that lived out in the country. The family was known as the Crooked Mouth family. There was Paul Crooked Mouth, and when Paul talked, he talked out of the side of his mouth like this. And there was Ma Crooked Mouth, and Ma, she talked out of the side of her mouth like this. And they had a son. His name was Clem. And Clem talked out of mouth sort of like this when he talked. And they had a younger daughter, Clem's sister, and when she talked like this. Because her mouth really wasn't crooked. Well, one night, it was bedtime, and they all got up and they went to bed. Ma and Paul were lying in the bed, and Ma reached over and hit Paul with her elbow. Paul, you forgot to blow out the candle. Please get up and blow out the candle. Well, I think I will. I wish you would. Well, I'll get up and go do it now then. And he crawled out of that feather bed, pushed the quilt back, and he went over to the candle, and he stood there and he went, Ma, what, Paul? Ma, I can't make that candle go out. Would you come over here and blow it out, Ma? Well, if I got to. I wished you would. I think I will. And Ma got out of the bed and she went over to the candle and she got up there in front of it and she went, but the candle flame didn't flicker. Paul, I can't blow out that candle. Well, what are we going to do, Ma? Well, why don't we get Clem to come blow out the candle? Okay, I think I will. I wish you would. Clem, would you come over here and blow out this candle? Well, okay, I'll see if I can. I wished you would. I wished you would too. So Clem got out of the bed and came over there. And he got in front of the candle and he went, Ma, Paul, I can't blow the candle out. Well, we gotta do something. Yeah, we gotta do something. We can't sleep with this light on. What are we gonna do? Maybe Elizabeth could blow it out. Well, why don't you ask Elizabeth to come blow it out? I think I will. I wish you would. Elizabeth, would you come blow out the candle? Okay, Paul. I will, because I ain't getting no sleep. Well, I wished you would. I wished you would too. Yeah, I wished you would too. So Elizabeth got up and she came over to the candle and she went, and that's it. We're in the dark.